Peace. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here as part of this festival. I'm also one of the festival organizers, and I've been hanging around Howard for about the last 15 years. So I love the university. Happy to be here. Really excited to assemble these four people here so they can share with you their insights. They've all been really influential on me. So yeah, just really excited. So as you said, this panel is called Wordsmithing for the Cause, Writer Activism and Intersecting International Struggles. One thing is this year's festival is honoring the late, great Amiri Baraka. The theme is specifically when what we want is sun, and that's a line from his poem called Kaaba. And to me, what he was alluding to in that poem and in that line is that despite oppression, we can move forward with determination and resilience in our work of creating our own sustainable prosperity. His creative works were very political and sought to improve this world for Africans and others whose communities are disrupted by European oppression. So that's our theme. So I'm gonna introduce each of our panelists, and then I'm gonna frame our discussion, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So first, I'll go in order. So Dr. Jared Ball is a professor of communication and Africana studies at Morgan State University. He's author of the book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. He's also the host of the podcast, I Mix What I Like, and his decades of emancipatory journalism, media, writing, and political work can be found at imixwhatilike.org. Other books that he's written include I Mix What I Like, A Mixtape Manifesto, A Live Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. Our next panelist is Jamila Minix. She's an author and attorney whose debut novel, Moonrise Over New Jessup, which is about a woman's story in an Alabama town that thrived in its intentionally all-Black and anti-integration stance, was highly acclaimed and won many awards, including the 2021 Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction. Her short stories and essays are published in many spaces, including Plowshares, The Sun, and The Craft. She's also a Howard University School of Law alum.
HU?
No. Okay. Our next panelist, Yasmin El-Rifae, is a writer, editor, and co-producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature, also called PalFest. That's right. She's a contributor to the recent anthology from the festival's organizers called Their Borders, Our World, Building New Solidarities with Palestine. She writes essays, criticism, and reportage, and is also the author of Radius, A History of a Militant Egyptian Feminist Revolution. And our next panelist is Leah Penniman. She is a Black Creole farmer, author, mother, and food justice activist who has been tending the soil and organizing for an anti-racist food system for over 25 years. She currently serves as founding director of the Soul Fire Farm in Grafton, New York, a Black and brown-led project that works towards food justice and land justice. Her books include Farming While Black, Soul Fire Farm's Practical Guide to Liberation on the Land, and Black Earth Wisdom, Soulful Conversations with Black Environmentalists. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists? So since the pandemic and the increased attention placed on the oppression of people of African descent in America, and subsequently other marginalized groups, we've witnessed an unprecedented recognition of and popular massive protests against the forces perpetuating that oppression, namely the American state, mainstream American institutions of all sorts, and the nefarious white supremacy that undergirds the entire system, including both the military and prison industrial complexes. The well over century-old reparations movement, for example, has made unprecedented strides during the past few years. More recently, that widespread awareness and attention has broadened to include the pervasive international reach of the American system, namely, its geopolitically strategic support of other governments perpetuating apartheid, violence on many levels, and even genocide. Many people have been protesting America's support for the Zionist Israeli state for decades, but the past year of genocidal atrocities against Palestinians in plain sight and all over social media is now widely recognized, albeit still highly misunderstood by many others because of American politicians and media that shroud the truth with tactics of psychological deception, making them complicit as well. As a result, people have also become more aware of other related struggles around the world that are also ultimately the aftermath of European and American enslavement, colonialism, imperialism, and intentional destabilization that continues into the present. And this includes, perhaps more prominently, but still not getting enough attention, the situation in Haiti, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Those are just some that are getting more attention, but still not nearly enough. So as these things have kind of come more to the fore, I've noticed in my own life that a lot of people, that had little geopolitical awareness prior to the last year, all of a sudden are highly politicized. And I want to talk about what does that actually mean to be political. But I also noticed that a lot of them tend to start to feel very overwhelmed, seeing all the pain in the world and internalizing it, right? And that's something we have to talk about. How do you deal with it, live your life, but also do something about it? So, in the Black radical tradition, I believe it's useful for people to consider the intersections of the underlying issues at the heart of these struggles, such as sovereignty, self-determination, control of land and resources, all of these things which impact the very basic necessities of life, such as food and water security here and abroad, and what lessons can be cross-applied. So in this conversation, through the work of these writer activists, we can deeply consider what it means to be political, and not just within the limited bipartisan bounds of this political system, and also to be an activist, to do so from a decolonized lens, and how writing supports positive change, all while considering what the implications are for our lives right now. And with that, we can get started. So the first question is for the full panel, so we can just go one by one. Can you tell us generally about your writing and literary activity? In what ways are they connected to your activism and/or community-based work? And also include what motivates you and inspires you as you endeavor in that work. Let's start with you.
First of all, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and as I was sharing with my co-panelists, As I was sharing with my co-panelists before we got started, I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome, given that my approach to this craft is not one of the kind of genuine appreciation and love just for the act of reading and writing that many real writers and people who read love to do. I admit I've only ever engaged reading and writing out of political need or professional necessity. So I don't mean that, I mean that to be self-critical in terms of the quality of my writing. I don't think it sparkles when I go to read and edit my own work.
I disagree.
I thought I was being asked. No, I'm just playing. No, when I talk to people about this, I often encourage, so one of my favorite writers is George Jackson, another is Frantz Fanon. Both of them read a lot of poetry. Both of them read a lot of fiction. So when you read their deeply political, heavy analysis, it sparkles, it has a flow to it. So I just mean that out of a profound respect for the people that I do know who really love to read and love to write and really work on the craft, which is important to do. And I just acknowledge that I don't do that. I do it, again, out of political need and professional necessity. So I've only ever wanted, specific to the kind of question you were asking, I've only ever wanted to do it in service of revolution, particularly underground, unsanctioned work, unsanctioned ideas, unsanctioned forms of communication. That's always been my preference. And I've always had it as a fantasy that the work I was doing would produce people who would do what I have not done, who would do what we see being done, for instance, in the resistance in Gaza. But that's been my approach. So you mentioned Baraka, just two quick things from him that I've always taken. One, he made the reference to Lenin's point about when you're dead. I'm not doing it justice in terms of the quality of writing, but reference to when you're dead, they rebrand you in service of the state. And then he also said at one point in reflection of Jesse Jackson's, one of his political presidential campaigns, he said the contradiction he kept running into is one I still think is prevalent today, that is both the slave and the slave master cannot be right. So we have to have a certain perspective as we engage whatever that we're doing, and that's been how I've tried to engage.
Talk about big shoes to fill. It's a pleasure to be here today, and good afternoon, everybody. HU. So my work follows a woman named, my novel follows a woman named Alice who moves to an all-black settlement in Alabama. I'm not sure how many of you all are from south of the Mason-Dixon. All right. So one of the things that when we talk about being political, my work really talks about this reclamation of soil that I feel like very much belongs to us. And in the work that I have been doing thus far, a lot of the work has focused on reclamation of places in Alabama, which is where my family is from, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Virginia, places where we as Black people have been historically told that we do not belong there, that we don't want to be there. But over time, I think a lot of us have learned things about the South and things about ourselves and our ancestors and elders who are in the South that have served to blunt our imaginations. So much of our lives was built right there. My family, my generational family, is Alabama. So one of the things that I've tried to do in my work thus far is to make sure that we understand the power of where we came up. And I'm not talking about the power of how we were when we were enslaved. That's obviously a part of our history. But as we talked about a little bit earlier, I really want us to start thinking about our role as Black people in the diaspora and our history as Black people in the diaspora. So those of us who maybe aren't even from the South, South of America, some of us are in here are from the continent. Some of us are from the Caribbean. Some of us are from places far and wide. But when we think about our generational ancestry as something I think is very different than our ancestral ancestry. Because when I think of where my people come from, my people are Alabama, but my people are also Yoruba, and my people are also Bantu. And so I want us to start to think about how we are connected as a diaspora, how I can go to somebody how I have commonality with somebody who is Yoruba in Cuba, and how our history was disrupted by white supremacy, but how our communities have always been community. And so even if I write about a Black settlement in Alabama, or if I write about another Black settlement in Alabama for this new novel, I'm not really leaving Alabama anytime soon. But the things that we do in these places are very much rooted in our history and our ancestral history. So I'll give you an example. My granddaddy and his 4 brothers all built one another's homes. And they brag about this, and this is in Alabama in the early 1900s, and they bragged about it as something that they did collectively. They also lived on something that they called the family compound. This is not something that was born in Alabama. And so I want us to recognize the ways that we have power within our community. And by even saying that, by even talking about a Black community that is empowered, you invite all of these conversations about Black supremacy and all this stuff, which I absolutely don't believe in, but I do believe in Black sacredness. And so my political act is to write about and reinforce Black sacredness.
Hi. It's really, really wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the wonderful organization. I feel very taken care of and well hosted here. And it's delightful to be here with all of you and on stage with all of you. I feel like we have a lot to talk about. I think that maybe the best way for me to start is to kind of explain a little bit who I am and where I'm from. I'm from a little bit farther away, but you'll see it's all connected. So I'm from Egypt, and I've spent most of my life in Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world. I lived briefly in the US and am now based in London. And I came to writing as a journalist and an essayist, kind of in my 20s. You know, I always loved reading and loved writing, and I kind of thought I'll figure out how to make a career out of this. And then the revolution broke out in Cairo, which had been a really sort of, a really static police state up until then. So there had been these kind of small breakout protests, a lot around police brutality. And that kind of was a building up of some kind of social movement that was very focused on the sort of the dignity of the body and police brutality, and also kind of, you know, economic corruption and neoliberalism and so on. And so I got caught up in that, and it was a completely transformative experience, as revolutions are. And it was a moment of revolution across the region, right? There were uprisings in Libya, in Tunisia, in Syria, all across. And at the middle of all of that was Palestine. And there was there's a saying of the road to Jerusalem runs through Cairo. The idea being that those freedoms are interconnected, and really you can map that out across the region. And if, you know, as I'm speaking, Lebanon is being bombed, not for the first time. So it's really it's a geographic reality. But it's just to say that Palestine, even for those of us who could not go there, was in the middle of that movement and that quest for freedom. Now, as some of you probably know, the stories of those uprisings ended really badly, again, as they often do. And in the middle of that turn, well, first I'll say about, I wrote a book based on some organizing that I did during the revolution in Cairo, where I was organizing a militant feminist group that was essentially organizing people to go out and fight against mass sexual assaults that were targeting protesters in Tahrir Square. So that was also really extreme and transformative work. And the effort of the book is to try and look at that very extreme and sort of overwhelming experience, and potentially overwhelmingly dark experience, right? When I say that, it's like something really sort of dark and heavy came into the room, and it can kind of seem like a black box. And I was interested in looking really sort of carefully at what that was like for many of the people involved. So I was interested in writing something that was, you know, trying to sort of find some kind of balance or tension maybe between being multivocal, but also claiming the authority, you know, like not kind of being disingenuous. Like in the end, I'm the author of the book. I'm the one making the decisions about how to write it and what to include and what not to. And my own kind of processing and interior world does play out on the page, as it always does, whether or not you think that that's happening, right? It all ends up there. So that's the book that I wrote, which is called Radius. And yeah, really trying to de-exceptionalize, not de-exceptionalize, but kind of, connect an experience that can seem sort of disconnected and extreme and really specific, which it was, but is ultimately connected to all kinds of questions of, you know, sexual violence, mass movements, the loss of revolution, the haunting of revolutionary movements, and so on. But back to Palestine, I would say that a really central thing that happened for me as a writer was that as these revolutions were starting to falter, as they were starting to turn towards, you know, the horrific sort of military dictatorships and wars that we see in places like Libya and in Egypt, I went to Palestine for the first time. And I had an experience of sort of seeing the thing that had been unseen and kind of quiet, but sitting in the middle of everything, which was the fact that all of the processes that were shaping the society that I lived in and that I was struggling within in Egypt, the processes of, you know, police brutality, neoliberal policy, corruption, all of these were swirling around a colonial project and a US-backed colonial project. And I say this because I think it's also really important, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about this later, but it's really important in this moment to understand, without reducing everything to America and America's power, but to understand specifically this war, this genocide that's happening, and the warring on Gaza and the warring on Lebanon as American military efforts. That is what they are. So, yeah.
I'm really moved by the power of what each of you has shared so far, and honored to be here with all of you. I'm a land worker, farmer, and I want to share a story that happened just a few days ago. So I was part of an interfaith delegation that works on transformative justice with incarcerated folks, and we went to Ulster County Correctional Facility, a medium security facility just a couple hours from us, because the men incarcerated there had invited us to do a ceremony at the conclusion of this year of nonviolence that they were doing, and this restorative justice where they had invited the guards to change their ways, their violent ways, and had made some strides that they were very proud of, completely unrelated to farming. But when I showed up, it turned out that they wanted to do this ceremony and put this peace pole in the farm that they had started. And the senior elder, the incarcerated person who was in charge of the program, got up to give a speech and picked up a tattered, worn, dog-eared copy of Farming While Black, my first book, and looked right in my eyes and said, "This book is what has kept me going." He's been incarcerated for over 25 years, 2 more years until parole. And they use Farming While Black as the curriculum. They initiated this farm. They feed themselves. They have a solidarity share program where they give away free food to low-income families in the area. I mean, the tears were just, like, I don't even understand what's happening right now. This is incredible. But I share that because as an author whose writing very much is in service of social change, that's the only reason that I write, to know that the book means something to somebody who is that marginalized, that is that oppressed, that is that much under the boot of the American mass incarceration imperial colonial system, that this man told me that when he gets out, the family has land in North Carolina, heirs property, and his first project is gonna be to save that heirs property, right? And to continue on the farming legacy. You know, Malcolm X talks about revolution being based on land and land being the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. And when you look at these struggles at home, when you look at the struggles globally, you see very much it's the land, it's the minerals under the land, it's the water under the land, it's the control of the airspace that drives so much of this oppression and brutality. And Black farmers have lost almost all of it. You know, the peak of our farmland ownership, and I say that in quotes because you can't really own planet Earth, she owns us, but you know, holding the paper, was in 1910 at 16 million acres, or about 14% of the nation's farmland. We're down to 1%. And we don't have any land, we don't have any property, we're completely out of the picture. And the land grabs happening across the world, including on the continent of Africa, should be very, very scary to us all. So on our farm, you know, we work on equipping and training and inspiring a rising generation of Black and brown farmers. We work on indigenous land back. We have partners in several countries across the globe that are doing grassroots organizing around land reclamation and reclamation of our ancestral ways of caring for the land, the ways we build each other's houses, the ways we collectively steward land in, you know, kin centricity. So all of this is really, this reclamation of our indigeneity, this decrying of colonization is really important at the grassroots. And I, you know, like you, I found writing by accident. I was just blogging for our organization, and then a magazine asked me to turn the blog into an article, and then a publisher asked me to turn the article into a book. And so Farming While Black was the first book. Black Earth Wisdom is, like how you said, multivocal. And I think I didn't quite master the authority of my own voice in that one, but it's 40 prominent Black environmentalists, and the point of that anthology is to reclaim the Black ecological tradition, which has been so whitewashed and stolen from us. We have another book coming up about raising children connected to the land, some biographical work about some of our heroes in the movement. So we're keeping it going and really seeing the incredible transformative power of the word, and to know that this man in particular who I met on Friday, literally keeps this book under his pillow as a beacon of possibility on the other side. That was enough. I was like, if I just wrote that book for that moment, like, ashe, So.
Thank you. Oh, you all are amazing. Well, next question, before I say anything else. What ways, and this is for everybody, what ways do you see the cause you work on intersecting with other important contemporary social and political movements, domestic and/or internationally, as well as historical social and political movements? And anybody can start.
I mean, I think Leah said it so beautifully and so perfectly, that our connection to the land, and it's not about ownership. And I think that that's something that we should all really consider, that traditionally, historically, ancestrally, our understanding of what it meant to live and be in community with one another, to live on land, to be a piece of something that was bigger than ourselves, was not consistent with the way that we have been taught in this sort of Western way to grab at one another's land, to own land, to put fences up. I think it's really interesting if you think about like the South Carolina Sea Islands and the people who my people are from Alabama. We call it the surrender where I'm from, my family. So when we're taught this lie about the emancipation, so if you hear me say the surrender, that means that the Confederates surrendered the war. Anyway, so language matters. Anyway, so at the surrender, right before the surrender, a bunch of Baptist ministers, a bunch of preachers got together, and they were asked, what is it that you all want? And the response was, we want land, and we want to be left alone. And so this whole idea of 40 acres and a mule came out of this idea that people collectively wanted to get together and work together. And what you found when they were given this opportunity, when the land actually came to them, they were able to build collectives where they didn't have fences, where they didn't have the sense that I have a deed, so this is my property line. Like all of that stuff is a very Western construct that's imposed on our understanding of how we embrace the land around us. And as a result, because the land is something that becomes so fragmented, our communities become fragmented in this way, and it allows white supremacy to fragment our community in this very insidious way. And so I think when you talk about what's important to us as far as our work, for me, it does feel like, even the idea coming up and being told land is wealth, the idea of land being commodified in this way, it felt on one hand very transformative for a Black family, for my family to say over and over again, land is wealth. But then as I've grown and I've understood just how much white supremacy even plays into that phraseology, to think of it in this very commodified way is telling. So, when we talk about moving forward and how, particularly like the work that I'm doing now, the work that I've in my novel, it really, I think the idea of us claiming space where we can be whole and complete among one another and find connection and commonality and community and complexity among one another is something that, to me, that feels it does feel almost revolutionary. It feels very much like when we say we want land and we want to be left alone, that feels very revolutionary in a way that it shouldn't, because all we're asking for really is to be in community with one another and to hold space with one another and for one another.
I'm going to pick up from you in thinking about this, about land and the fragmentation of it and the sort of the use of it and everything natural as a sort of source of plunder, right? The sort of commodification and the stealing and the dispossession of native communities and so on. And then the plunder of the bodies of the people working the land as well, to turn to Palestine. and to say that, I mean, I don't think I think it's probably impossible to overstate the connections between the subjugation of the Palestinians and the subjugation of Black folks in America, and therefore the connections between the sort of possibilities for liberation, or at least the possibilities for living a life that's like oriented towards liberation, right? Even if you don't live to see it. And you know, there's lots. If we think about books and literature, there's so much there. You know, I mean, every radical Black thinker has taken up Palestine, whether or not they've been, right. That's the other thing I talked about. You know, my going to Palestine. You don't need to go to Palestine to understand or to get it or to see the connections. There's so much there to read and so many people to talk to. But we can see you know, in this moment with what's happening now in Gaza and in the region, the connections are also very material, right? Look at the profits of the biggest weapons manufacturers, the ones whose bombs are being used now to kill what is probably, according to the Lancet, which is like a medical journal that's kind of done a mapping of what the actual real death toll in Gaza is going to be once you get to count all the people who are stuck under the rubble and all the people who've just disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of human beings, and now, you know, almost 1,000 people killed in Lebanon in a matter of less than a week. Those weapons manufacturers, those are the same weapons manufacturers that are involved with militarizing the American police force, the police force that jails and brutalizes and kills Black bodies. I mean, it's really all there. And when we think about fragmentation, I mean, I think we also have to think. So I, as an Egyptian and as an Arab, I'm very sensitive to the fragmentation of the land. I'm very sensitive to how hard international borders have become. Nowhere other than Gaza, between Gaza and Egypt, is an impenetrable border. Egypt has become a jailer of the Palestinians in Gaza through the sort of geopolitical power structures that are at play now, of which, you know, the U.S. is ultimately the beneficiary. But there's also the fragmentation and the borders that kind of that keep us away from each other in our consciousness, right? The kind of the feeling of alienation, not just from one's community, but like a kind of disconnection from the processes that are actually shaping and determining one's life and the use of one's tax dollars and so on. And, you know, this is whatever long-form way of saying capitalism and smartphones and all that. But these things are, you know, they are actually real, even if they're to do with the interior life and our psychologies and our attention or our consciousness. It's a real living fact. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that one of the goals, at least, that I have with the work that I do, which is mostly non-written in other forms, but it is to draw these connections. And then, for instance, I see a lot of it happening on my campus at Morgan State right now. The same militarized programs that are dropping bombs on Palestinians are putting more and more militarized police on our campuses under greater surveillance, building up more STEM-related programs under the guise of advancing Black people into the 21st century with technology, meanwhile just training them to go work for these same companies. I mean, there's all kinds of incestuous, crazy relationships here. So one of my small goals is to just try to draw those connections and to be in community with other, again, unsanctioned communicators around the world who are trying to make these points, to say we're all starting from a place of relative colonization. How do we then reach up from these bottoms of the well, as Derek Bell called it, and connect in radical ways? So that's just been a goal for me in some way, that I try to connect with people that I've never met, don't know, and may never likely see, but who are doing that kind of work wherever they are.
Can I just, yeah, I feel like that's like the lifeline, right? Is the fact that people do manage to make those connections, to write towards them, to write for them, to find each other, to sort of, you know, I mean, I'm thinking of the Palestinians who wrote and contacted and you know, posted in solidarity with people in Ferguson, in 2014, and that was really a kind of accelerator of a lot of like much more grassroots connections between the two places that have then, you know, we've seen that kind of flourish. And I think it's just important as writers, and as I was saying when we were speaking before coming on stage, I find it very hard to take this kind of division between politics and writing seriously, or like activism and literature. Like I really dislike the word activism as well, or maybe I just never felt it fits for me. Like I understand why people use it, they're trying to quickly communicate something about someone. But for most people in the world, the kind of work that one would call activism is simply just being, and the kind of literature that one would call like political literature or activist literature would simply be them writing about their experiences. So I think there needs to just be a starting point of a refusal of these like sort of categories, and yeah, kind of, I mean, when I'm reading or writing, I'm kind of searching for I don't know, for how to orient towards a more connection, really. Yeah.
I'm noticing my head and heart just swimming in overwhelm of how many intersections there are and where to focus in. Yes to everything you all said, and I was thinking particularly about how Black and Turtle Island indigenous, the divide and conquer techniques that the colonial empire has tried to use were really surfacing for us several years ago around the efforts for the Black community to reclaim exactly this foundational yearning. The exact quote is, "What we need are homes and the ground beneath them so that we may plant fruit trees concerning which our children can say these are ours," out of the Freedmen's Commission in Falls Church, Virginia. And understandably so, our indigenous comrades and friends were like, well, wait a minute, this is our land, right? This is our land, so how can you reclaim land that's our land? And we've had so many beautiful listening to one another's suffering conversations over the years amongst especially the Northeast indigenous communities, and understanding the ways that, you know, white Americans own 95% of the land by acres, 98% by value. So we're talking about 2 to 5% that we're all arguing about amongst ourselves. So, you know, so all that to say, you know, there's powerful work going on around land trusts and also showing up for each other in these ways like Ferguson and Palestine. There's an action going on next week that some of us will be part of. I don't know if you all know, but the US nuclear arsenal is getting old, and they're not gonna honor the non-proliferation treaties. They're replenishing the stockpiles of nuclear weapons right now as we speak, and this is not disconnected from Israel at all. So the uranium for the new round of super bombs, which are 100 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that uranium is coming from the Havasupai Nation in Arizona, right next to the Grand Canyon. So there's an interfaith, Buddhist-led, multi-ethnic, Black indigenous solidarity action going on to put bodies in the way of the trucks that are carrying the uranium to build the super bombs that can destroy the world many times over, that are planned to be dropped on Black and brown people around the world, right? And so it's all freaking connected. Like, the absolute plunder of the land to create a death machine is happening right now. There's not a single news story about this. This is not a single, you know, and it's just, yeah, I just feel the vibration of my body of the horror of it all, you know, and just so grateful to be in this room of people who are trying to do the things that we can in our lifetime to stop the war machine, the death machine, the colonial machine. But yeah, it's all connected.
And you know what's so ironic about that? There's all this plunder and all this stealing in order to destroy the very land that everybody is fighting over and trying to colonize in the first place. So it's sort of this, if you think about it, it's a very juvenile way of looking at the world, because it's basically saying, if I can't have it, I'm gonna destroy it. And, you know, it's so—
Right, if it wasn't horrific, it'd be cheesy, you know? It's just like, really, fam?
Right.
Are we three? But these are nuclear weapons.
But these
right?
are nuclear weapons. And so you think about, you know, the way that we as, like, ancestrally, we looked at land, right? And then you look at the ways that through colonialism, through imperialism, the idea of land, and Imani Perry has a book coming out early next year, and she talks about how the commodification was even related to how the justification for enslavement of Africans came about. Because there was a man, he went to Africa and he was sort of looking around at the things that Africans gave value to. And he was talking, and the book is Blacks in Blue. It's coming out next year. I highly recommend you all read it. And he sort of looked at and denigrated the fact that these Africans, the Africans that he was looking at the moment, he said, you know, they really give more value to the color blue and to these blue beads than they do all the gold and the riches and the lands and the minerals in the land. And so because of that, his justification was these Africans don't understand the value of things, so they are savages, right? And so you see the justification of the plunder of the land, the plunder of the people, and then when it's all used up and destroyed, you see the proliferation of all of these people coming in and then saying, okay, this place is not worth saving. And that attitude goes around the world to Black and brown people. It comes right into our communities of Black settlements that have existed in this country since the late 1700s, where people have lived there and been successful communities. And then once the communities are plundered, then they become what? The ghetto. And then you don't want to go over there after midnight. Meantime, our ancestors and elders held it down for generations, for a century or more. And so it literally is to the point about nuclear weapons. If I can't have it, if I've used it up, and now the people, the land, and the minerals are gone, now I want to destroy it. And that just goes for the whole world.
We'll be good. Bezos and them are going to space. I feel like it's all set.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like there's a lot of stress over here. Just relax. Bezos and Branson are going to space. We'll be good. Trust the billionaires.
Eat the rich. What are you talking about? Trust them. You better eat the rich.
There's a Krobo proverb, I don't remember it in Krobo, but it says, the old woman, Yamoya, with her black bead is more powerful than the white man on his pile of riches. The black bead is the magic bead, so the spiritual power, the ancestral power. It's like we know the gold is there, but we made a different choice.
We made a different choice, right.
So we're gonna go to questions after this, questions from the audience after this next round. But obviously one of the biggest themes here is land, right? And having control of land so that you can control your own destiny and take care of your community. I think one of the things I thought about as you all spoke and you talked about Amazon, one of the ways that we perpetuate our disconnection from the land is by all these products that we consume and that we don't have to farm to eat, right? We might eat really unhealthily, right? All these packaged goods that have all the things in them that are unhealthy, the things in the packaging. I saw a report the other day, like by the day, we're becoming more and more plastic, right? Our brains are becoming more and more plastic. The ocean is full of plastic because of this consumerism and availability of things, but things become cheaper and more available and not as good quality because of the exploitation of land and people. At this point, you can just go on Netflix and watch all the documentaries and figure that all out. It's not hard to figure that out, right? And Amazon is a big part of that, clearly. But bringing it back to Palestine as well, I did get to visit the West Bank myself, Bethlehem, years ago, because I had to see for myself. I grew up with Palestinians, friends all through high school, and I still have some best friends that are from there. And I was wearing a Malcolm X shirt. And you know, if you're familiar, there's walls that separate all these Palestinian communities. And I saw Malcolm X was painted on the wall. So I took a picture, and I love that picture. But clearly Malcolm, I think the essence of Malcolm's message and being is very much a part of this discussion. So this last question, I want to kind of talk about narratives and storytelling and what that really means for these different struggles and causes and movements. So I guess this question, I want to start with you, Dr. Ball, but generally the question is how do you control narratives and how do narratives support these different causes and empowerment of our people, right? And I want to start with Dr. Ball because one of his that I feel like very groundbreaking books. So I read, I'm sure many of you can relate to this, but I read Autobiography of Malcolm X when I was 13, And that changed my whole life, changed my whole perspective on everything, right? That changed everything. And I've heard many other black men say this. But the narrative around Malcolm, has been under attack, who he really was and what he was about. And Manning Marable came out with a book, or Penguin Press did, with him as the author, about 10 years ago. And it was really an attack on the narrative around his life. And Dr. Ball, I think, is such an example of literary activism. And I know, the word activism, I agree, like it's just a word, but the reason I think you all are such a perfect panel is because you all live the stuff you talk about. You don't just talk about it. You don't have to call it activism. You just, like you said, you're just being who you are. So yeah, the question is, what's the importance of narrative building and storytelling? And start with you, Dr. Ball.
Well, I mean, from the perspective of those who I end up studying and with whom I have a hostile relationship with, they're very clear. Narrative is warfare. It is part of the military full spectrum dominance goal. They publish their counterinsurgency manuals online. You can read, they say specifically the goal is to manipulate popular symbols within target community groups. Huey Newton said a long time ago, the problem with our decolonization efforts and reclaiming land, one of the many problems is that the communicative capability of empire crosses all these nominal borders which they created themselves for the purpose of exploitation in the first place. So from their perspective, narrative is everything. So when people, when I'm asked, why are you critical of a Netflix movie or whatever, it's because of that. Because that narrative is part of an imperial project that justifies almost in advance what we see. One of the reasons they were able to get away with, to the extent they are, what's happening in Gaza right now is this long process that Edward Said and others have been talking about for decades of lay down the narrative. These people don't deserve life. When I was on an aircraft carrier and I'm standing around a group of bombs being lifted up to go be dropped on Iraq, a group of black men stopped and watched this white man pushing the bombs with us, and we're writing messages. Right. F you, Saddam. This is for you, Saddam. And the white man in our group writes, die, sand niggers. And I'll never forget, we all just stopped for a second. And everybody kind of looked at him. He said, what? I said, sand. And we let it go. It worked. In that moment, it worked. The bomb went up and was eventually dropped. Our ship alone dropped 800,000 tons on those people. I'll never forget, they painted it on the masthead so we would be proud of it, 800,000 tons, and you contributed to this. And the narrative driving that was they deserve it, and it's for your freedom. It's gonna benefit you. So anyway, narrative is incredibly important, and to the extent that we're able to combat it, this is why Greenblatt of the ADL got caught on tape telling everybody, we're losing the narrative. Even young Jews don't like what's going on. Get out there and fund some stuff. Pay some people. Even TikTokers, they were saying, get some TikTokers out there. The bombs aren't going to stop. The point is, we're not going to stop the bombs. So the point is, how do we rebrand the narrative so that people will find justification in their support of it? So that's why I think, to whatever extent any of us, now the real thing that comes behind narrative is, in terms of a response to that, the only real narrative control we have is explicit, overt, interruptive behavior. Because we're never going to end up winning. We can't out-narrative. The only way the narrative is being broken that Greenblatt is upset about is that people got in the streets, people started building, people started moving offline, people started challenging. That's what damages the narrative. I will stop here. Marshall McLuhan, one of my favorite media scholars, this Eurocentric white man, it's always wild that he's one of my favorites, because he said, we don't know who discovered water, we know it was not the fish. An all-pervasive environment is always beyond perception. And he warned, even from his white Eurocentric perspective, the only way for oppressed people to communicate in this increasingly dominant, sophisticated, and pervasive environment is through what the West would define as terrorism and violence. And he's right.
Me? Well, I do think to answer your question, I have two things that I think about quite a bit. And the first is the way that we craft our narratives. As a writer, as somebody who's been through the publishing process, and there are a few of us in here who have been through the publishing process, every word that you put on the page is not only a craft decision, but it is an act of activism. So for instance, in my book, I had several battles with my editor about having a white savior. There's no white savior in my book. I had several battles with my editor about wanting more trauma. And, you know, I'm not here to tell anybody else how to make their art. There is art that I will not consume because I do see how editors over time, over these very discrete, myriad craft decisions in a particular book can make so many decisions that they take the book away from us. And so when we're consuming this book, and the book is being hailed as a book by a Black author, and it's about Black life, and it's about a Black community, but you see what I call the editor's paw prints all over it. And so you see the things that you know the editor has probably had a conversation saying, this is what's gonna get you on the New York Times bestseller list. This is what's gonna get you a book club. This is what's gonna make you successful. This is what's gonna help you to get those prizes. And so when I think about our stories, and I think about even the response to people, the work that I've done where people say, I never heard about a Black community or Black settlements. There's a reason for that. There's a reason that we don't pass our stories along. And it's not always just because some white editor has their paw prints in our work. It's because we are not passing our stories along. It's because we're telling ourselves that our stories started in 1619 in the United States. And so when you're trying to make these connections throughout the diaspora, we're not understanding that what's happening in Gaza, what's happening to Black and brown people all over the world, there are connections that we have to those people. The very oppressions that they're suffering are the same ones a lot of times that we're suffering here. And so I think it's important for us when we talk about narrative and preserving narrative, we have an obligation when we tell our stories, whether we write a word about the prison industrial complex, whether we're writing a history of our family, whatever we're writing, we have an obligation to do it with an eye single towards creating or talking about communities in a way that is true and honest to our community. Because people can take a lot of things away from us. They can't take our stories away. And our grandparents, our great-grands, our ancestors, our elders have been talking to us and telling us these tales, and then we listen to what else is going on in the world and let people tell us and give context to what our ancestors and elders are telling us is the truth. So I implore y'all, when you go home and you talk to your ancestors, or you talk to your elders, and when you talk to your ancestors, because I talk to my ancestors, ask them not about things in the context of what they were doing in a particular movement. And I'll say this until the day I die. Don't go to them and say, what were you doing during the civil rights movement? Because when somebody comes to you in 50 years and says, what were you doing during the Black Lives Matter movement? You're gonna say you were living. Right? You're gonna say you were fighting, you were writing, you were singing, you were dating, you were doing all these things, but you owe them the honor of giving full context to who they were, so you know what the full context of who you are. So that's my first thing. My second thing, I'll be very brief, but there is a concept called illusory truths, and it's when somebody lies so much that it has the perception, it takes on the perception of reality. And what happens is exactly what's happening with our Haitian brothers and sisters, not just in Springfield, Ohio, but all throughout this country. So we're passive, but what happens in our community is we think, oh, it's funny, we're gonna pass around these memes, and it's ridiculous. And I'm not saying it's not ridiculous, but it's an illusory truth that one, white supremacists want to believe it. And so all they need is a little kernel of something, some lie, some wretched, ratchet lie to believe, and they hold on to it, and now we have bomb threats for our babies, for little kids who can't even go to school on picture day because some raggedy person decided to call in a bomb threat. So I implore us, when we think about how we're fighting back against the narratives of illusory truths as well, to fight back. Humor is a really powerful, powerful tool in the Black Diasporic Handbook. But be responsible with what you're calling humor, because our Haitian brothers and sisters all around this country are being threatened and being terrified and terrorized because of a lie. So I just implore y'all, when we talk about our narratives, we have an obligation, I think, particularly as Howard students. This isn't a storied institution, it is the Mecca. This is the incubator of storytellers, of dreamers, of people who take opportunity and give all sorts of opportunities to other people. So I just implore y'all to make sure that you're making conscious, smart decisions about how you carry our stories forward.
I can build on that a little bit, this idea of realness and truthness and central narrative. So it's possible that what unites a people is a shared story, a shared central mythology. You know, you think of the Haudenosaunee or Six Nations people and their connection to this idea of the great tree of peace and the coming together of the warring nations. You think of the Hebrews and the Exodus, the sort of central narrative, and how that then influenced Black Americans. You think of the Christian community and this idea of original sin that Jesus washed away, and how that, so story is really important. And there's been a debate in the Black farming community centered around the realness or truthfulness of an emerging central narrative. So according to the research of some anthropologists, including Judith Carney, it might be true that generations ago, our ancestral grandmothers had the audacious foresight to braid seeds into their hair, watching their cousins and brothers and uncles get kidnapped, some people having to move up to 40 times in a lifetime from village to village to avoid the raids, that they got in the practice of braiding seeds into their hair as insurance for being dispossessed, displaced, and that some of those seeds made it through the bowels of transatlantic slave ships onto the plantation, into the provision gardens, and that those seeds have been carried forward. There are incredible oral stories among maroon communities across the diaspora of the seed braids, of the rice grains falling out of the trusses onto the ground, and with those seeds, these ancestral ways of caring for the land being passed on. The mounding of the earth, the cover cropping, the rotational grazing, the irrigation technologies, the fertility technologies, the collective work technologies. And this story has given a lot of people fortitude, because we can imagine that in this time of terror and uncertainty, that the faith in land and the faith in seed, like if our ancestors could hold on to that, then who are we to give up? Right? Who are we then to not do our own version of that seed care? But there's this raging debate, and some of my respected comrades are just like, is that really true? You know, here's XYZ reason why, you know, science, Western science can't verify these oral histories and da-da. And so it's rich and it's juicy and it's wonderful. And also, I am curious whether it matters, actually. Whether it matters that the sea parted and the people walked across. Right? Whether it matters that the great peacemaker's hair turned from snakes into hair and then the tree sprouted. Whether it actually matters if it was true, because maybe it's real enough that it unites us in our common identity.
Okay, thank you all for all of that. We're gonna move to questions and answers. So if you have,
so if you have any questions, can you please line up on this side? We want to prioritize the students. So can the first 4 to 6 questions be students, and then we'll let everyone else go after that.
Also, while you all are coming up, I just want to really encourage you to check out the books after the panel, perhaps get a book signed. We have a book from Leah as well as from Jamila. Jarrett and Yasmin's books are not there, but you can also find them online, of course.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm a Blessing King. I'm a junior political science major, criminology minor from Birmingham, Alabama. And
Okay, Birmingham.
hello. And my question for you guys is, seeing that there is a huge disconnect in members of the Black community when understanding the importance of community and intersectionality and kind of deterring from our own internalizations, how can we fix that? And, how do we get rid of the it's you versus me mentality? Like, I know in Birmingham, we just had a mass shooting, and like, that's very, I don't know, disheartening to hear that. And to hear that we're still struggling with, uniting. So, yeah.
Is that for any of us in particular or all of us?
No, but you can speak first.
Oh, okay. Since I asked the questions, I opened my mouth. I think one of the things that we all have in this lifetime is the opportunity to grow and unlearn behavior. And there was a rap lyric, I think, that's supposed to have made a whole lot of women mad lately, Latto calling women brokies, right? And I look at that and I laugh because, first of all, you hear all these brothers coming out talking about, brothers in the rap game have been reading us for broke since the beginning of hip hop, right? And so welcome to the club, ladies, like somebody called you broke, whatever. But I think that over time, when we look at, there's so much in our community that we have in common, but I think what happens over time is we get really entrenched in these places. And that can start with, my family's the Young family out of Demopolis, Alabama. I'm supposed to have a blood feud with every Jones and Johnson in America. Nobody knows why, but Jones and Johnsons is a lot of people. But you see people get entrenched in these sort of places. And, I think a lot of times it's just within the community, I'm not talking about outside the community, within the community, I do think we owe one another some grace. When it comes to somebody saying something to me that I didn't like, somebody looking at me the way I didn't like. But I think we also, my thing is, sometimes there's stuff that's going on, like the mass shooting in Birmingham. There was a shooting in my auntie's neighborhood in Montgomery the other week too. And it's a lot of stuff that if we stop to think about it, about the destruction of our bodies, the potential destruction of our bodies and the bodies that we're shooting at, the people who we're beefing with, who we're like, it's on site with you. It's like, if we step back for 1 second and think about what that means for each other, as opposed to the empowerment, the power that we have when we are working together. I don't know, the wanting us to be a monolith is never gonna work. We're not all gonna agree. I have people in my family I can't stand. But I love them, I stand 10 toes down for them, but they're not my favorite people in the world. But I do think that there's a level of grace we owe one another. I think there's a level of unlearning. I think a lot of this comes from the seed of white supremacy and colonialism, then anti-Blackness that a lot of us have absorbed into our souls. So there's a lot of unlearning of that anti-Blackness that as you grow, you start to recognize those things. Anti-Blackness is why we're calling each other brokey, right? Because that's capitalism, and that's all this stuff. That's all the embrace of all the white supremacist ideals that are totally against what we are as a people. So I don't know. I don't know that there's an answer to that, and that's a really tough question to answer. But I do think that it starts with us and identifying and unlearning and growth. I don't know that there's a better answer, and passing that on to somebody else. I don't know that there's a better answer. I hope one of y'all has one.
Just join organizations and find comfort in collective study of how how society structures impact and encourage this behavior. I think that's a great way of developing appropriate responses.
Well, thank you.
Hi, my name is Jayla Sheffield. I'm a junior environmental studies major, community development minor from Pomona, California, here at Howard. And my question is to pick up off of the last question that was just discussed about narrative and about specifically how Kamala Harris has been trying to change her narrative and her platform, her political platform, her policy, and kind of rebrand herself as from someone who has been pro-fracking, who has been anti-immigrant, who has been Zionist at various points of her career, to now being the Black feminist hero that is going to save our democracy from Trump. So if you can just talk more about that narrative, and also how here at Howard, because she is an alumni, how do student organizers combat that narrative, and how do we make sure that we are politicizing our peers to know what voting for her really means and what it does not mean?
Just to note, we have like 7 people and maybe 12 minutes, so let's try to get through quickly each question.
You're right, and just very quickly, there has been a beautiful, slick, but yet overt attempt to connect her to Fannie Lou Hamer as well, to say that she's the modern day Fannie Lou Hamer. It's outrageous. So I think the line of questioning you've already entered into is exactly the right direction to go in, and we should be overtly encouraging. Malcolm X was brought up earlier. He encouraged independent Black political parties. We should be encouraging voting for any number of these so-called third and alternative groups who have brilliant campaigns. Please look into them. Party for Socialism and Liberation, Claudia and Karina, even Butch Ware and Jill Stein have a very compelling argument. Even Dr. West and Melina Abdullah. Look into their arguments and look into the histories of the development of alternative parties and their suppression, led often by the Democrats. Malcolm was clearly anti-Zionist. Kamala is clearly pro-Zionist. And this narrative that's been developed that says we should somehow vote for the one carrying out the genocide as a reward for the potential that she will be better than Trump is bananas. And that narrative should be challenged, and part of it should be our exodus into some leftward electoral option and beyond. Abandon Harris. That effort right there is great. I mean, this is a largely Palestinian and Arab Muslim-led effort that have said we cannot reward the current genocider in chief with a vote with this promise that somehow doing that and voting for one carrying out the genocide is somehow going to make it better in post-election. So abandon Harris.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Kari Ianzime Johnson.
It's on site, bruh.
I'm a history major, and I had a question for all of you to answer. Well, 2 questions, but the first one, would each of you be able to speak on the emotional currents that guide your work or your writings? And the second question is in regards to people and land, what are aspirational goals you seek to have your work ultimately contribute to?
What was the first question? Emotional currents in our work? What, you know?
I mean, I would say that the emotional currents of my work are really that I want us to think about Black empowerment in different ways, think about the rejection of anti-Blackness and white supremacy as it permeates our communities. And I want us to think about just the sacredness that is who we are and what we're capable of. And then what was your second question? You know, my hope is that my work ultimately has us thinking more in terms of our diasporic ancestral story, and that we start to look at and we really understand the disruption that chattel slavery in the Middle Passage was to our history, that our history didn't start here. And I think because we are sold that lie, too many of us think of Blackness, which is itself a social construct, think of ourselves in a very limited way, because we see what has been done to us, what has been done to Black and brown people around the world without understanding who we were and who we are, despite the colonialist efforts and the imperialist efforts to suppress us. So that's a very powerful tool of suppression, is to make sure that we don't know our own stories. And so my hope is that my work bridges those gaps.
Very briefly, the emotional currents in my work are a fierce, uncompromising love for the soil and the people who are the color of the soil and who tend the soil. It's love in the morning, noon, and night. And our aspirational goal is the liberation of acres of land from colonial powers and the return of that land to the people who are not human supremacists, who embody ecological humility, who have an understanding of sharing and justice and non-plunder. We need at least 200 million acres liberated in my lifetime just in this country, and millions of more acres around the globe, including all of Palestine. That's the aspiration.
Hello, my name is Ayana Smith-Taylor. I'm a physics major from Houston, Texas. And right before this, I went to English, and we were kind of talking about media and the picture that it's painting. So my question for you guys is, how do you feel about the idea that the present time media, as including writing, TV, is working towards the erasure of Black ancestry and history?
Terrible. I mean, I feel terrible about it, but I also feel like because we know it's happening, who do we expect to undo it? You know? I mean, we know it's happening. We know that it's happening in real time. You cannot expect the people who are erasing our history to undo that erasure. And so I think it's really important for us to acknowledge it and also to fight back against it, to preserve our own stories.
So I just want to add something very quick. When I was an undergrad, my favorite course was media critique, because it teaches you how to look at any media and see all of the stereotypes and see all of the things that are affecting your subconsciousness, like the music and the colors and everything. And I think it's something so important to, as a parent, to teach our youth how to do that, because it's very difficult to really monitor and censor what they're witnessing, but the most powerful thing you can do is create in them a critical consciousness, so that no matter what they witness and encounter, they will be able to approach it with the historical context to understand it, navigate it, and not let it oppress them, or even see the oppression that's occurring and be able to navigate it. So I think we need to teach our children how to do that.
Okay, these are going to be the last 3 questions for the Q&A session. Before we go into that, I did want to make an announcement that tomorrow's festival will still be in this building. The program says that it's going to be in another building, but it will actually be in here. And then we have one final panel this evening at 5 p.m., so please come back for that.
Hi. So I'm Victoria Moten. I am a PhD student in the English department here at Howard. And my research, my research for my dissertation, so I'm still formulating it, is to look at the connection to land as a technology, that it empowers us, that, we can reclaim, our agency through it. But I find that I like to call myself an Afrofuturist solar punk. But I find that that's not very interesting to people, right? With urbanization, secularization, digitization, nobody seems to care, right? But if we embrace this idea of connection to land as a technology, where do you see us in the future? What can our future be? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, I think people will find it very interesting once they embody it. This is something that has been really powerful at Soulfire Farm. I will tell you, fam, I really thought we were gonna be out there alone in the woods. And I'm introverted. I've been told actually I'm introvertuous. This is a new term. So I didn't mind that much. But we have a waiting list around the block of Black people who wanna come hang out on the land. Why is that? Because of exactly what you're talking about, the technology of the land. And one of the primary technologies that she does all by herself is to compost some trauma into hope. You know, I mean, land was the scene of the crime, right? But she was never the criminal. That's right. And when we get reintroduced in sovereign terms with agencies surrounded by folks who look, talk, act, eat, dance like us, there's this magic that happens. You know, I was physics and chemistry and biology, like the sister over there. And so, you know, I'm here talking about cation exchange capacity. And meanwhile, people are talking about getting their whole life because the land made it possible for them to see a future that they didn't ever imagine. And we talk about this all the time, you know, that a lot of things that we don't think of as technologies, including our ancestral farming practices, our cooking practices, all of these things which we can build on for our futures, they are absolutely technologies, and they make it possible for us to imagine 14 generations ahead. Like, Western society is on a crash course to oblivion. We are gonna have no soil left in 50 years. Our climate is a wrecking ball right now. These are not sustainable technologies by any measure, but our ancestral technologies, which are not static and frozen in time, we are continuing to innovate on them. They are sustainable for millennia. And so we need to reclaim that wisdom in these very practical, right, and objective and numerical terms for people to understand, as well as the embodied way of understanding.
Hi, everybody. My question is essentially, being at Howard University, June Jordan said, "I must become a menace to my enemies." Knowing that the university and academic institutions in general are active and enthusiastic participants in death economies and the industrial complexes that deal death around the globe, and knowing what they do here in terms of recruiting and all of those things, and how the university colludes with police departments to scare students into out of resisting, how can students at this university and others become a menace to their enemies, knowing that everything is kind of designed to scare them into passivity and apathy?
So I'm a graduate of the Howard University School of Law. One of the things that I'm going to always encourage y'all to do is know your rights. Know that you don't have to talk to anybody. Know that you have the opportunity, the right to peacefully assemble. I want you all to really take seriously, if you're talking about police coming to intimidate you, there's a beautiful picture of this sister from Maryland, and she's standing there, and there's a police officer with a rifle in her face, and she has her hand to the rifle because she knew she had the right to be there. Now, I'm not saying that you should stand there and let somebody point a rifle at you, but I do want you all to understand what your rights are when it comes to being in a space. I love this school. I love this institution. I hope that I'm in a place where people love the school that they're in, but it doesn't mean that we didn't attend a school that we have philosophical disagreements with. It doesn't mean that we can't challenge the administration. And so I want you all to understand that you do have rights and to know what those rights are. It's not enough to be loud. I used to deal with a lot of lawyers who are really loud and very wrong. So when you are going to stand up, when you are going to challenge authority, know the law that supports you and be able to say it. You all stand up beautifully and you elocute. So be able, when you're in these spaces, to understand, I have the right to be here. This DC ordinance, this law allows me, the First Amendment allows me to be here, to stand here and peacefully protest. Be right and be loud. All right?
So this panel is how I learned about the festival and why I chose to come down from New York. So I just wanted to thank you all for being a part of it. My name's Christian Davis Bailey. I'm a co-founder of a group called Black for Palestine and a writer. And my background as a writer started more as a journalist and like political writer. Recently did an MFA at a predominantly white institution, and I've learned more here the last 2 days than I learned in that MFA. So thank you again for that. But just wanted to name a few tensions I have in my own writing to see if you have any advice to speak to them. One of them is this balance between political writing and artistic writing. As a former op-ed writer, I can be very heavy-handed with politics, but that's not necessarily what reaches the average person picking up a book. And in trying to figure that out, I might lose sense of my voice or the audience and like having a more mainstream readership in the background. And lastly, it feels like the more political or critical you are, the harder it might be to get published, especially if you're speaking up around Palestine. But yeah, these are just some of the different things that I'm holding and trying to work through. Thank you.
I think for me, this is a question of, it comes down to what is the actual text or the actual piece, right? As somebody who's written a range of sort of nonfiction so far, I haven't ventured into fiction, but you know, there is the writing of an op-ed or an urgent essay where you're trying to communicate something that is urgent, political of the moment. You're trying to make an argument, perhaps even be polemical. That is going to be a different piece, a different tone, a different style than something that's much more reflective, where you are trying to figure something out as the writer. And there's probably an art to both, but I think I'm sensing from your question that maybe you're more looking at the tension between the one and the other, and with the second being the more artful, right? Like when there are maybe different sort of crafting questions at play and questions of voice and so on. And I feel the same, and I think that the latter is the more kind of where the writer is an artist, right? And that means that even if what you are writing about is something deeply political, your work and what you're doing and the reason that you're there at the page is because you need to work something out about it. It's not that you have an urgent message to relay. It's actually you need to work something out, and you're gonna take the reader along with you, and then you're gonna try and do it beautifully, right? So it's just, yeah, a kind of distinction between the different forms, I guess.
I mean, all I'll add is I think it's important to resist the urge to answer all your own questions. It's not really an art form that lends itself to a thesis statement and proving your own thesis. That can come across as heavy-handed, but I think to the point of writing because you're working something out is really important. None of us have all the answers in the world, but I think it takes a lot of bravery in order to ask yourself the question and to really do a deep dive into the question so that others can explore their own philosophies with you through your work. The art will come, your voice will come, and there are certainly opportunities through different crafts classes and things to develop voice. But publication is always going to be a crapshoot. There are no guarantees in it. So what I always counsel people is when you're thinking about writing, their first obligation is to your art. When I wrote my book, I wasn't thinking about publication. I thought I was going to self-publish it and write it around Alabama to my family, talking about, hey, I wrote a book. And so opportunities came along, and I had a book to present to people and say, well, this prize is coming up, and I guess it could be something that could meet the parameters of this prize to socially engaged fiction. So, you know, nothing beats a failure like a try. Let me see. The first thing that somebody can do is tell me no. But if you don't have the art, if you haven't written the art, if you haven't, I don't like to say bled on the page, but I think as writers, we have an obligation to not only ask the questions, but to live in that moment so that we can pass along in a responsible way and allow our readers to bear witness. If you haven't done that, publication shouldn't even be on your mind yet because you haven't done the work to be published. So, I mean, I would just say, really think about the questions and really think about where that's going to take you, and the rest will fall in place.
The one other thing that I'll add, as someone who's an untrained writer but a prolific one, is tell stories. It's a way of getting across the assuredness of an argument, so even if you got it all worked out, but of also reaching people. And you notice even here as I'm speaking, I'm telling you about my time in the prison a few days ago, or the uranium mining, sort of taking these concepts, abstract concepts, down to a moment in time. And when you take it down to a moment in time, you can add a lot of juicy details and fabulous verbs and wonderful scene making and still be very fierce and incisive in your political point. So I'll say that, and just to echo what my wonderful fellow panelists have said, just write what's true, and that authenticity will get picked up by the right venue to share your work. Don't change yourself. Yeah.
Well, we want to say thank you to all our panelists for all your hard work and dropping all those gems.